Welcome. Let's start with a question. Imagine that you are living 500 years in the future. What sources from today would best help you understand what life in the United States is currently like? Today, we'll use this example for unpacking a distinction that is crucial to how historians do history: the distinction between primary sources and secondary sources. The distinction between primary and secondary sources is part of methodology. At its most basic level, methodology simply means the study of method, or even discussion of method, just like biology denotes the study of life or relevant discussion of it. Method is how we do something. And in many areas of life, messing up on method means messing up on the final product. By way of example, let's talk about chocolate chip cookies. You can't just take all of the ingredients and throw them into the oven. Rather, you have to mix them first. And you can't just mix random amounts of each ingredient. You need the right measurements. Granted, there is some wiggle room here. Maybe you like more chocolate chips, or maybe you add a little bit of cinnamon to the dough. So, what is methodology? It's the how and how we do anything, from baking cookies to researching and writing history. Before we define primary and secondary sources, let's continue with our metaphor. Primary and secondary sources are key ingredients in every good historical work. They are literally inescapable. And just like butter and sugar, primary and secondary sources need to be distinguished from one another. So let's get into some definitions. At the most basic level, a primary source is a source from a time period. A secondary source is a later work about that same time period. To go with the example that opened this video, sources from today are primary sources for studying life in the United States now. And 500 years in the future, when someone writes that book about life today, their book will be a secondary source. We don't use the terms primary and secondary to denote something like better or worse. And we're not talking about first place versus second place either. Rather, primary and secondary are really about chronological proximity. The primary source is from then and there. The secondary source is from later. Ideally, every secondary source draws upon numerous primary sources. A good secondary source will synthesize material found in and across many primary sources. A wider range of sources will give you a broader overview of a topic, far broader than a single source ever could. Nonetheless, primary sources are the building blocks of secondary sources, and this means that a good secondary source comprehends and makes sense of the relevant primary source material. Secondary sources can show us how representative an individual primary source is, but secondary sources do not determine the value of a primary source. Rather, it's the primary sources that help us determine the descriptive accuracy, and therefore the value, of any individual secondary source. There are many different kinds of primary sources. Literally anything can qualify. Here are some examples: letters, diaries, newspapers, political pamphlets, religious books, music, coins, paintings, etc. Please note, not all of these are textual. Some, such as coins, are artifacts. Historians generally privilege documentary sources, but this doesn't mean that other sources are irrelevant or less important. What should we look for when studying primary sources? Note that I use the plural, primary sources. When we do research, we want to look at many primary sources. Broadly speaking, We're looking for context. What is context? It's the big picture that helps us understand the meaning or meanings of a source. Think about the American Revolution. There are lots of possible primary sources. We have the Declaration of Independence. We have pamphlets by those who supported the rebellion, and pamphlets by those who opposed it. All of these materials help us understand the broad range of concerns that we find reflected in the Declaration of Independence. Looking at context means looking broadly and deeply at a wide range of sources. At the most basic level, try to identify these four things: the author of a work, the date of its composition, and its intended audience. We should also study reception, that is, responses to a work. However, we may not always have answers to these questions. For example, if you study ancient history, you sometimes have documents without a known author, and therefore it's impossible to know when it was written or who its original audience was. Nonetheless, there are four big contextual questions: author, date, audience, and reception. The more of these we can identify, the better. All of this has a payout beyond the researching and writing of history. You can use the distinction between primary and secondary sources to think about other things too, like current events. By way of example, let's say that people are debating a proposed law. Some people love the proposed change, some people hate it, and some people wish that it would just go away. You get the idea. What's the primary source in this debate? And what are some secondary sources? The answer is simple. The text of the proposed law is the primary source, but what people say about the law, these are secondary sources. They would include such things as news reports. News reports tell you about the law, but they aren't the law itself. And this raises an interesting question. How many of us, in our daily lives, really bother to read the primary sources of our own present day? Don't we generally rely on secondary sources, news reports, social media, the opinions of friends or family? But the primary sources are what matter. So, in other words, research skills are life skills. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button. Feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.